Boldwood presents A Fresh Start at Wagging Tails Dog's Home, written by Sarah Hope and read by Sophie Dora Hall. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Sally paused again, probably for the 8th time that morning, and waited for Puddles to stop lunging on his lead. Blowing her hair from her face, she looked across at Alex, who had borrowed Dougal, Poppy's cockapoo, and pocketed the treat she'd been using in an attempt to distract the small dachshund. I think I'm going to have to start back at the beginning with his training. Sorry for wasting your time, Alex. Hey, no problem. He's a real rascal, isn't he? Alex began to walk Dougal towards the paddock gate. Sally waited until Puddles had calmed down before following, keeping a few paces behind. See, this is fine. He's walking like an angel now. She glanced down as Puddles' little legs ran to keep up with her and pulled a treat from her pocket. Good boy, Puddles. You'll get there with him. Alex slipped through the gate from the top paddock into the bottom paddock, leaving it unlatched for Sally. You always do. We don't call you the dog whisperer for nothing. Ha ha. I think Puddles might actually make me hand that title back. Sally pulled the gate open. That's the 3rd time I think I've managed to train him not to lunge or bark at other dogs walking past, and the 3rd time he's shown me up. Honestly, no one would believe I actually thought he was ready. I believe you. Alex glanced over his shoulder, looked at Puddles, and frowned. That's the problem when we don't have a dog's history. We have no idea what he's faced in his little life. I know. Sally swallowed. Flora thinks he may have been used as bait in a dog-fighting ring. The scars suggest it. She bent down and traced her finger across the large, crescent-shaped scar on his back leg before fussing him behind the ears. He could be a royal pain with other dogs, but he was the complete opposite with humans, trusting and loving. A small miracle if he had been mistreated. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I hate humans. Alex shook his head before looking back at Sally and grinning. Apart from my Wagging Tails family, of course. Of course. Sally laughed. I know what you mean, though. Some people just don't deserve the love of an animal. Nope. Alex pointed ahead towards the courtyard. Looks as though we've got company. What do you think? Perspective? Sally peered ahead, squinting her eyes to make out the man's head. Neither. He doesn't look like a dog person. Besides, I shouldn't think he could kneel and pet a dog in that suit. My guess is a salesperson. Alex nodded. Good spot. Years of working in law will give you that. Maybe the years she'd spent training to be a solicitor hadn't gone to waste after all. She paused to let Alex through the gate into the courtyard before following with Puddles. She shook her head. That felt like a lifetime ago now. I guess we'll soon find out. Alex kicked the gate wide, so it stayed open for Sally. I'm sure we will. In fact, I'll leave Puddles in here for a runaround whilst we go speak to him. Bending down, Sally unclasped the bright green lead from Puddles' collar and distracted him by throwing a ball as she slipped through the gate. You don't fancy testing Puddles' social skills on a stranger? Not on one who looks as though he'd be happy to sue us if Puddles so much as stares at him. Sally laughed as she watched the man hovering at the gate leading to the lane outside Wagging Tails. There was something about him that made her feel uneasy. She'd never been a fan of goatees on a man, but it wasn't that. It was something else. Something about his presence. Fair point. Alex paused as Sally jogged to catch him and Dougal up. As they neared the gate, Sally pushed her shoulders back and plastered what she hoped was a welcoming grin on her face. Hi. How can we help you today? The man turned sharply and looked her up and down. Are you the owner of this place? No, I'm not, but we both work here, so I'm sure we can help if you have a query. Sally pushed her hands into her pockets and held his gaze. Over the years of training and studying law, she'd learned not to show people if she felt intimidated. Is she available to speak to me? I'm afraid she isn't at the moment. And she wasn't. Flora had left for the supplies a couple of hours ago. With anyone else, Sally would probably have offered to make them a cuppa and let them wait. Flora would be back any minute now. But not him, though. The sooner he left, the better. In that case, can I ask you to go to the trouble of ensuring she receives a letter? The man leaned his briefcase on the top of the gate and clicked it open. Sally glanced down at Dougal, who had positioned himself behind Alex's legs, his head leaning against the back of his knees. Of course, she said. Thank you. The man thrust a white envelope towards her, before clicking shut his briefcase. He was jolly nice. Alex scowled as he watched the man step into his BMW and drive away. I'm glad it wasn't just me who felt something was off with him. Did you see the way Dougal reacted? Kneeling down, she fussed over the small cockapoo. I felt it. I have a nice warm patch behind my knees now. Alex chuckled. Never mind. I'm sure that'll be the last we see of him. He didn't particularly seem a dog person, and that's an understatement. So I can't imagine he wanted to inquire about adoption. Alex turned. I'll pop the kettle on while you put Puddles back into his kennel. Tea or coffee? Coffee, please. Strong with 2 sugars, because even though you're sweet enough as you are, there's always room for improvement. Alex jumped back to avoid the empty poop bag Sally threw at him. Hey, I was being nice. Ha ha, I'd hate to hear you say something horrible then. Sally laughed and held out her hand. Can I have that poop bag back, please? It's my last one. Alex scrunched up his face and held the small bag in the air before passing it to her. Go on then, even if only to prove to you how nice I am. Thanks. She took the bag and held her hand up as she turned away. See you in a min. As she walked back towards the bottom paddock, Sally glanced towards the gate out onto the lane and shuddered. She'd got such a funny feeling from that man, and she just couldn't shake off a sense of unease. She looked down at the envelope in her hand. Apart from the owner, typed in Times Roman in black ink, the envelope gave nothing away. No watermark or return address. Nothing. Sally pocketed the poop bag and tucked the envelope under her arm before opening the gate into the bottom paddock. Puddles! Over here! Sally knelt down as Puddles trotted over, waiting until he'd sat next to her before clipping his lead to his collar. You're such a little mystery, aren't you? You can't stand other dogs, but you're so well trained in all other aspects, and I think possibly even the most well-behaved pup we've had at Wagging Tails. Come on, let's get you back in the warmth of your kennel. She began walking towards the gate and looked down at him. She smiled as his little legs sped along at 1,000,000 miles per hour, just to keep up with her slow walk. He must have an owner out there somewhere, a loving family who were missing him. It was the only explanation she and Flora could think of. He must have been stolen before he'd been abandoned on the streets. She sighed. Darryl had plastered his photo throughout the Tresto Telegraph for weeks now, and Sally had posted information in numerous local and not-so-local. All they could do now was cross their fingers and wait. Someone would be missing him. Sally was sure of that. They just had to hope that someone came forward soon. Let's get you inside. She pushed open the door to the reception area. As she slipped through to the kennels, she could hear Alex and Ginny talking in the kitchen. Alex was likely telling Ginny all about their encounter with the stranger by the gate. Flora would be back soon enough, and they could find out what was inside the mysterious envelope. Sally wrapped the lead around her wrist to shorten it, readying herself for the inevitable. Yep, sure enough, as soon as they walked past the first kennel, Puddles began pulling on the lead and barking. She quickened her pace, making the journey to the very last kennel as fast as possible. The tiny dachshund had barely been at Wagging Tails an hour before Flora had made the decision to move him into the kennel at the far end. Yes, it meant he had to be walked past the other dogs on his way in and out, but it was better than him becoming distressed every time another dog was walked past his kennel. At least this way, he could hopefully relax once he was safely inside his temporary home. Here we go. Home sweet home for now, little Puddles. Sally unclipped Puddles' collar and closed the kennel door before standing and watching him. They all knew they were kidding themselves. He never relaxed, not fully. He was always on guard, waiting to be forced to choose between flight or fight. Taking a treat from her pocket, Sally bent down and slipped it through the metal bars. Whatever has happened to you, you're safe here, Puddles. I just wish you could understand that. With a sigh, she made her way back into the reception area. She let the door swing quietly shut behind her and looked out across the courtyard. The van was parked outside now. Flora was back. As she pushed the kitchen door open, Alex looked towards her. Here she is. Alex held out a mug to her. I was just telling Flora and Ginny about the encounter we had with the strange man hovering by the gate. The strange man hovering by the gate. Ginny laughed. It sounds like the title to a thriller or something. Oh, it could have been. He was really off, wasn't he, Sally? Alex leaned against the counter, his hands wrapped around his mug. I don't think he was here to adopt. He didn't seem at all interested in Dougal, who we had with us at the time, and normally potential adopters at least greet the dogs. As Sally placed her mug on the table, she pulled the envelope from her pocket. Here you go, Flora. He gave us strict instructions to pass this on to you. Oh, I bet I know who this is from. Who? Ginny asked as she reached into the biscuit tin. A man called Lyle. Flora tore the envelope in two before scrunching it in the palm of her hand. Lyle? I don't think I've heard you talk about a Lyle before. Ginny bit into her biscuit and then quickly wiped away the crumbs from her top. Ooh, the mystery deepens. Who is he? Alex hitched his mouth into a playful grin. An ex-lover's son who, after hunting you down for years, is after vengeance on behalf of his father after you ran off with his inheritance. Ha ha, nothing so innocent, I'm afraid. Flora chuckled. No, he works for a property developer who is trying to buy this place. He's rung me at least 5 times over the past month. A property developer? Sally raised her eyebrows. Yep, apparently his company bought the fields behind and has now decided they want to expand to include Wagging Tails. Flora threw the scrunched-up pieces of envelope in the bin. Of course, it goes without saying that I won't be selling, and I'll be standing against planning permission being granted. Too right. We don't want a huge housing estate behind us. Alex shook his head. And think of the noise, Ginny added. How much land have they bought? Sally wrapped her hands around her mug. I'm not completely sure, but from the short conversation I had with him on the phone last week, it sounds like a lot. I'm assuming it's all of Mary and Giles's old place. The whole farm? I thought they were selling it to another farmer. Sally took a sip of her tea. They'd known the farm was up for sale. After Mary had passed away last year, Giles had told them he would be putting the farm on the market. His children had no interest in continuing the family business, and he decided to move to Wales to be nearer his daughter. I'm guessing so, yes. I assumed the same. So what do they want with Wagging Tails? Sally frowned. They'll have more than enough land to build on and make their millions, surely. Flora shrugged. Greed, I suppose. Maybe. Still, if he's already contacted you, then it seems odd that he won't accept your decision. Ginny pulled another jammy dodger from the tin. I could see if Darryl will ask around. I know he has a couple of contacts in the council. They might have heard something about this man's plans. Oh, yes, please, if you wouldn't mind, Ginny lovely. Flora smiled. I'm not going to give it another thought, but it would be interesting if Darryl could find anything out. Chapter 2. Sally grinned and held up her bag of chips before flicking her hair from her eyes. Ginny shifted position and stretched her legs out in front of her on the sand. Yes, well, you really do need to start taking proper lunch breaks. Sally looked out across the ocean. The day was warm, uncharacteristically so for this time of year, but with it being term time and out of season for tourists, they had the whole cove to themselves. Not that it got busy during the tourist season. Or Sally didn't think it did anyway. She'd only arrived down here in West Par last summer, but it hadn't seemed as though their small village was a holiday hotspot or anything. Probably thanks to the village being small and positioned away from any main roads. You know I'm right, and besides, I have orders from Flora to try to encourage you not to work through your breaks. You're a fine one to talk, Sally laughed as she popped a chip into her mouth. Ginny looked down at her feet and circled her ankles. Well, maybe, but we can't have you getting burned out, not with the likes of little Puddles relying on you. And besides, I don't have a second job. You do. Yes, but the training sessions I do in the evening don't really feel like a job. I enjoy them. Sally tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ears. A bit like working at Wagging Tails, really. That doesn't even feel remotely like work. Haha, I know what you mean. Ginny turned towards her. You haven't told me how your date went last night. Oh, so that's the real reason you dragged me to the beach then, to quiz me about my love life. Sally laughed as she watched a squabble of seagulls dip and dive over the water. Honestly, I've told him I don't see a future between us. What? Tucking her legs up beneath her, Ginny turned to face Sally. You only said yesterday that he's everything you look for in a guy. I know, he is. He's kind, funny, and he wants the same things as me, but... She shrugged. But what? I don't know. I guess I just don't feel that spark. She closed her eyes against the low spring sun. You literally said he was perfect. Ginny scrunched up her forehead. And he is. On paper. Even in real life, he'd been pretty perfect. Last night had been their second date, and they chatted into the small hours, taking their conversation to the all-night cafe in Tresto when the pub had closed. This is about your ex again, isn't it? You always do this. You meet these wonderful guys, but you always hold them up against him. Huh, you remember me talking about Andy? Of course I do, especially being as the last time you... Oh. Sally bit another chip in half, letting the salt linger on her tongue before it dissolved. She turned towards Ginny. Do I really talk about him that much? Only when comparing the men on the dating sites to him. It's Andy this, Andy that. Oi! Sally threw a chip at Ginny. I'm not that bad. Ginny watched the chip land on top of her chip wrappers. Thanks very much. Smiling, Sally shook her head before frowning. Andy isn't even my ex, he's my ex. She counted it out on her fingers. It wasn't that she'd had lots of relationships since Andy. Quite the opposite. It was just that she hadn't let anyone get close to her the way she had with him, and so all the relationships since had been fleeting. Some would probably argue not even fully fledged relationships. Ginny was right. She compared every man she met to Andy, which was daft. She knew it was. It had been 7 years since they'd gone their separate ways. 7 years of building walls around her heart. 7 years of not giving any other man a chance. You're right, though. It is because of him. But what do I do about it? I can't help the way I feel. Felt. I don't know. I've never had that problem. My ex Jason was the complete opposite. Ginny shivered. He wasn't a very nice person at all. See, that's my problem. It's because Andy was nice. He was kind, caring, funny. He was everything I look for in a guy. I suppose you just need to remember why you split up. Ginny pointed a chip at her. That should help you remove the rose-tinted glasses. Sally swallowed. That's why it's so difficult. It wasn't as though we split up because something went wrong in our relationship. We hardly even argued. It's quite the opposite, really. I had to move back to my hometown. She placed her chip wrappers on her knees. No, that's not actually true. I felt like I should move back to finish my training at my parents' law firm. Why didn't he move back with you? Sally picked up a chip before placing it back down. He wanted to follow his dreams. Once we'd finished uni, we travelled for 4 years, working along the way. When we came back to England for one summer, my parents made it no secret they thought I should put my law degree to good use and finish my training. But he wanted to carry on travelling. Sally nodded slowly. He said he didn't, that he'd move back with me, but I knew he didn't want to. Settling down in one place was the complete opposite of what we'd spoken about. So I broke, Ginny said, pointing. I did. It was for the best. I didn't want him regretting his decision and holding it against me. Wow, I didn't see that coming. I assumed he'd broken up with you. Oh, thanks. No, just because of the way you speak about him, the way you compare any man you try to date to him. I assumed the breakup hadn't been your choice. Sally nodded sadly. Yes, it had been her choice. But she really hadn't thought there was an alternative. She thought she'd done the right thing, letting him live the life he wanted. I sometimes wonder how things would have turned out if I hadn't broken up with him. I bet. Sorry. Ginny tailed off. It's okay, it's true. And now I don't even use that precious law degree my parents were so desperate for me to have. I didn't even finish my last year of training. Sally snorted. Do you regret that? What? No chance. I was never interested in becoming a solicitor. It was what was expected of me, to follow in my parents' and then my sister's footsteps, to work at the family law firm. Me, though, it was never my passion. Working with the dogs is my passion. She grinned as she thought about the dogs in their care. Ralph, Puddles, and the newbies who had arrived more recently. Each and every one of them was why she did what she did. Ginny shook her head. I can't imagine you as a solicitor. Not serious enough? Sally raised an eyebrow. Not that. Just that I guess I'd always thought of you as someone who preferred the company of animals to humans. I guess you're right. Sally threw her last chip in her mouth and scrunched her chip wrappers up. Talking of which, we better get back. Hold on. We've not finished talking about date guy yet. Gary, was it? Or Gavin? Gary. There's nothing else to say. I messaged him this morning and told him I'm not ready for a relationship. Standing up, Sally held out her hand for Ginny's chip wrappers. Thanks. Ginny passed her the wrappers and stood up too. Are you really not ready for a relationship yet? After 7 years? Or is it that you're comparing everyone you meet to Andy? Sally shrugged. I don't have time for anyone. What between working here and evening training classes twice a week, I've not even mowed the lawn in weeks. Oh, I bet your neighbour loves that. Ginny laughed. Ha, exactly. I've already had Mrs. Morton tell me to go careful, in case I stumble over the flower beds. Sally grinned. It's not even that long. You mean it's less than a metre tall? Exactly. Sally laughed, joining Ginny, and threw. Who are you taking out for training? Ginny asked once they got back to Wagging Tails. I'll go and walk someone else. She held the gate to the courtyard open. Thanks, I'm going to take Luke out and do some socialisation skills with him, Sally said as she slipped through. Oh, I love Luke. He's such a sweet little thing. Ginny closed the gate behind them, or should I say a sweet big thing. I think he's one of the tallest greyhounds we've ever had. He's such a sweetie, and with a bit of socialisation and training, he's going to make a wonderful companion for someone. He sure will. Plus, he's such a bright boy. I think he'll adjust to home life after being on the racetracks quite quickly. Yes, I think you're right. Sally held the door to the reception area open and paused. Great. That man was back. Glancing back at Ginny, Sally grimaced before clearing her throat and stepping inside. Lyle, the suited man who had given her and Alex the envelope, was standing in front of the counter, and judging by Flora's expression, he wasn't quite getting the hint that he wasn't welcome. "Hello, lovelies." Flora's face relaxed as Sally and Ginny stepped inside. "Afternoon?" Sally walked behind the counter and positioned herself next to Flora. Lyle glanced at her for a moment, a look of irritation flashing across his face, before turning his attention back to Flora. "As I said, I think you'll find our offer is more than satisfactory." Flora crossed her arms. "And, as I've said to you, I'm not interested, and nor will I ever be." "I think you'll find the offer life-changing, Mrs. Matthews." He pushed a cheque, face down across the counter. "I don't think you understand," Ginny cut in. "She said she's not interested." Reaching across the counter, she pushed the cheque back. Ignoring both Ginny and Sally, Lyle pushed it back towards Flora. "Take a look, but if you insist, I shall have a word with my partner and see if we can come up with a more enticing offer." And with that, Lyle stalked out of the room, the door swinging shut behind him as he crossed the courtyard. Sally frowned. "I didn't see his car in the lay-by. Yesterday he'd just pulled up outside the gate. No, he parked up in the car park this time." Flora sighed. "Who does he think he is? Coming in here and trying to negotiate with me. I've told him time and time again I'm not interested in selling." Ginny picked up the cheque. "It'll be interesting to see how much he's offering, though. It'll tell us how desperate his company is." "No, that's what he wants, for us to look." Flora took the cheque and tore it into a million pieces before throwing it in the bin below the counter. That. Chapter 3. Sally took the final bite of her cheese toastie before pushing the empty plate aside and pulling the pet shop catalogue from the bag at her feet. After picking up her mug, she leaned back in her chair and looked around the small cafe. This was one of her favourite escapes, situated in a small courtyard off a side road in Tresto, the closest town to West Parr. She watched as Harold, the owner, bustled about serving cakes and tea to the customers. She took another mouthful of coffee and held it in her mouth, letting the bittersweet taste linger. She'd not found another coffee place good enough to compete with Harold's yet. She placed her mug down and focused on the task in hand, choosing new equipment. She flicked through the thin catalogue, and there it was, the page with the agility equipment. Some of this would be the perfect addition to what they already had and would be fantastic for Nala, the very energetic 1-year-old Flora had taken on from the pound last week. As a collie cross, Nala was bright and needed something that would get her thinking alongside running off some of the energy she had. Sally pulled the order form from the back of the catalogue and scribbled down the items she wanted. A seesaw and a new A-frame. Those, in addition to the wobble balls, new frisbees and tennis balls she had in a bag at her feet, would keep the Wagging Tails dogs occupied for a while. "Do you want a top-up, Sally dear?" Sally looked up and shook her head as Harold indicated her almost empty mug. "No, thank you. As much as I'd love one, I really must get back to work." "Of course." Harold smiled, the laughter lines around his eyes deepening. "You get back to those lovely little pups of yours." She watched as Harold bustled back behind the counter before picking up her mug and taking another sip. She really did need to get back, and she was excited to see how Ralph would react to one of the wobble balls she'd bought. Sally sighed. Ralph had people who loved and cared for him, and that was more than many. He was happy at the home. She knew he was, but... She slipped the catalogue inside her bags, which she rested on her knees, keeping the order form out. She'd pop that back to the pet shop on her way to her car. Hopefully they wouldn't have to wait too long for the delivery. Sally paused. Her bag handles looped over her wrists and picked up her mug again, taking a big gulp and draining the remaining coffee. The cafe was getting busier now, the lunchtime rush beginning. She looked across to her mum with a pram and toddler in tow and nodded towards her table. "I'm just leaving if you want this one," Thank you, that would be lovely. The mum turned to her young son. George, go in. Sally balanced her empty mug on her plate and picked it up. The least she could do was to take it to the counter and save Harold the job. With only him working here today, she knew he was about to get rushed off his feet. As she walked the short distance between the table and the counter, she lifted her plate up as another toddler ran towards her. Sorry. A woman apologized as she chased her young girl towards the back of the cafe. No worries. Sally smiled. The toddler group held in the community hall must have just finished. She turned towards the counter and froze. Couldn't be. Great, thanks, Harold. You're a star. It was. She knew that voice. She knew that face. Those eyes. He even sported the same haircut, the slightly too long surfer style. The stubble, though, that was new. She shook her head. New? What was she thinking? She hadn't set eyes on him in 7 years. But it was him, wasn't it? She watched as he turned and leaned against the counter, pulling his mobile from the back pocket of his jeans and scrolling down the screen as he waited for Harold to make up his order. He hadn't seen her. That was probably a good thing. He wouldn't remember her anyway, not after all this time. Her mouth suddenly dry. She swallowed. She needed to get out of here, and quickly. She held her breath as she lowered the plate and mug to the counter, the mug wobbling and clattering against the plate. Do you need some help with? He turned, and the colour drained from his face as he spotted her. Too late. She quickly picked up the mug, setting it back on top of the plate. She could feel her cheeks burning as she met his gaze. Andy. He rubbed the palm of his hand across his face and blinked. Sally? It is you, isn't it? Sally glanced towards the door and bit down on her bottom lip. She'd daydreamed about this moment for years, randomly meeting him, and yet now it was happening. It was all she could do to stop herself from running at breakneck speed out of the door and into the street. Yes, it is. She shook her head, forcing herself to meet his gaze again. How are you? Good, thanks. You? Yep, great, thanks. She nodded. What was she supposed to say? What was either of them supposed to say after 7 years of not seeing each other? Here's your coffee, Andy, mate, Harold said, interrupting the awkward silence hanging in the air. Tearing his eyes from her, Andy picked up the cup. Thanks. Anyway, I'd better... Sally pointed towards the door. Yes, of course. I'll walk with you. Andy held his hand out, signalling her to go ahead. She nodded. Why did he want to walk with her? What was she supposed to say? What did he want her to say? She couldn't very well blurt out how much she missed him and tell him she regretted her decision to end things, following the expectations her family had put upon her. Andy pulled the door open and held it for her. Maybe we could... Andy, mate, you've forgotten your toastie. Harold's voice rose above the hubbub in the cafe. It'll be ready in a moment. Andy raised his coffee cup to him before turning back to Sally. Maybe we can meet for a drink, a coffee, or dinner? Had that been a look of disappointment that had flashed across his face when Harold had called him back? Sally swapped her shopping bags into the other hand and held her hand against the door. Coffee would be nice. Fantastic. Great. I'll message you. He smiled. You still got the same number? Sally nodded. She did. She'd never changed it, just in case. Yes. I'd best... She nodded towards the street as she stepped outside. Yes, of course. It's been lovely running into you again. You too. Turning, she let the door fall close behind her. As she crossed the road, she glanced back briefly. He was still there, on the other side of the door, watching her. It was him. Andy. She'd only been speaking to Ginny about him the other day, and now… What? He was here? In Tresto? Did he live here? Had he moved down to Cornwall? Or was he just passing through? But Harold had known his name and had even called him mate. He couldn't just be passing through. Harold knew him. At the car park, she pulled her keys from her pocket, hearing the familiar little click as she unlocked her trusty old Focus, her hands shaking. She threw her bags on the passenger seat, sat down and stared at the wall in front of her car. Would Andy really message her and arrange a catch-up? Or was he just being polite? He was probably just being polite. It was what people said to each other when they ran into one another unexpectedly. He wouldn't really message. Why would he want to? She'd been the one to finish with him. She shook her head and laughed at herself. Who did she think she was? Just because she pined after him, it didn't mean he had. He probably had a long string of relationships since her. Or he was married. Happily settled down. Yes, he probably had his own little family now. Wife, kids, probably a Labrador or two thrown in. She was lucky he had even recognised her. She slapped the steering wheel. Enough. That was enough. She was not going to go down the road of daydreaming. No. She was going to go back to Wagging Tails, give Ralph his wobble ball, and forget all about this chance encounter with the man she loved. She shook her head. Used to love. She would forget the chance encounter with the man she used to love. A long time ago. Years ago. Chapter 4. After stepping through the door into the reception area, Sally lowered her bags onto the counter and sighed. Are you okay? You look as though you've seen a ghost. Ginny frowned, looking up from her clipboard. I have. Sally slipped onto the stool behind the counter and held out her hands. She was still shaking. Ginny hung the clipboard back up. What on earth has happened? This will make you laugh. You know we were talking about my ex, Andy, the other day. Yes. Well, Sally took a deep breath. I've just run into him at the cafe. What? Seriously? Ginny planted the palms of her hands flat against the surface of the counter. Yes, seriously. So, what happened? Did you speak to him? Yes. I was just leaving and he looked around, saw me, he actually recognised me, and asked how I was. Sally pinched the bridge of her nose. Or at least I think he did. Or asked something anyway. It was all a bit of a blur, to be honest. But he did say he was going to message me to arrange a meeting for a coffee and a catch-up. Oh, when are you meeting? We're not. He won't really message. Why don't you think he will? I don't know. Why would he? I'm nothing to him now, just the woman who broke his heart 7 years ago. He's probably settled down, happy. He looked happy. Had he a ring on his finger? She hadn't noticed one, but she hadn't looked either. She shook her head. It didn't matter. The absence of a ring didn't mean he was single. He might, Ginny said. If he said he would message, then I'm sure he will. Have you checked your phone? She indicated to Sally. Sally pulled her mobile from… With her thumb hovering over the screen, she frowned. Oh, give him a bit of time. You've only just got back. He's probably still out. It's not that. He's already messaged. She blinked. Yep, he definitely had. Then what are you waiting for? What does it say? Ginny leaned her elbows on the counter and cupped her chin in her hands, watching Sally intently. Taking a deep breath, Sally opened the message. Sally, I hope this is you anyway. Lovely to run into you earlier. Would be fantastic to catch up over coffee. You free this evening, 6 p.m? The Unicorn. Andy. Kiss. She shifted the stool closer to the counter and show the screen to Ginny. He put a kiss, Ginny pointed. He always used to put a kiss to everyone. That means nothing. A smile flickered across Sally's lips before she frowned again. The kiss meant nothing, more than nothing. What shall I say? Yes? You've not got a training session tonight, have you? Please say you haven't. No, that's tomorrow. She joined Ginny in resting her elbows on the counter. What do I say? How do I reply? Ginny laughed. You say yes. You say that you'd love to meet for a catch-up and you'll see him at the pub tonight. I can't. Why? Ginny sighed. You've not got a training session and you were literally talking about him the other day. Why on earth wouldn't you want to meet him? I do. I want to. I just... Sally shrugged. She couldn't explain it. I don't want to find out he has a partner, a wife, kids. I know he probably does, but I don't know if I'm ready to find out. She shook her head. That doesn't even make sense. Hey, yes it does. Ginny reached across the counter and cupped Sally's hands, so they were both cradling the mobile. But even if he does have a family, at least you'll know. Sally took a deep breath and straightened her back. Oh, you're right. It's best to know. At least I can have closure after all this time and move on. Ginny nodded before grinning. That, or something else entirely. Sally tapped her mobile against her chin. She knew Ginny was just trying to be nice, to tell her something she wanted to hear, but she didn't want to hear it. It was her own fault she and Andy had split up, and she wanted him to have had a nice life. That's why she'd broken their relationship off. For him. And if he was still single, then that would make her feel worse. Reply. Yes, okay. It would be nice to hear how he's been, the adventures he's been up to. Sally began typing. Done. I'm meeting him tonight. She swallowed as her stomach lurched. Was she really going to have coffee and a catch-up with the man who she'd quite possibly made the biggest mistake of her life for? Good. I'm sure you'll have a great time. Ginny picked up the clipboard again. Maybe. I guess, if anything, it will be interesting to hear all about the places he's visited. The places I could have visited, if I'd followed my own path in life. You'd have only regretted not going if you'd ignored his text or turned him down. I know, you're right. And Ginny was. Sally was glad she'd agreed to meet him. She was. It was just nerves, that's all, and regret. Right, Ginny said, turning and hanging the clipboard up once more. I'm going to go and take Ralph out into the top paddock. She picked up his lead. Oh, I bought him a wobble ball. I thought he might like the interaction. Sally rummaged through the bags before pulling out the bright green ball. That looks good. I'm sure he will. Ginny took the ball and turned towards the door. See you later. Raising a hand in a reply, Sally looked down to her bags, just as the tring-tring of the landline filled the room. Afternoon, Wagging Tails dog's home. How can I help you? Hello? I think you have my dog, the small dachshund. Imagine that, Puddles. Your family are coming to take you home. Sally fussed over the dog sitting next to her on the sand. Flora had been right. Puddles did have a home. She traced the small black marking by his tail, a little heart. She watched as he stretched his front paws out, yawned and turned around before settling back down. I bet you're tired out after terrorising poor Mr. Euston and his little dog, Grey. There really was no need for you to be quite so vocal when you saw them coming. She blushed as she remembered poor Grey almost pulling Mr. Euston over when they'd come round the corner, and Puddles had begun to pull on his lead and yap continuously. Hopefully, when his family came to pick him up tomorrow, they'd shed some light on how he'd got into this habit. She wondered whether he'd always been grumpy towards other dogs, or if something had happened to him before coming into their care. Whatever the answer, she was determined to help his family and had been scouring the internet for trainers close to them in St. Ives who would be able to carry on with the training she'd begun. Sally turned her face towards the sun. It was warm today, again, and the hope of summer on the cusp of the horizon. It was strange to think that in a few months she'd have been down here for a year. So much had changed in such a short space of time. She'd be forever grateful for her Nan for making her take the leap to leave her training and the city. Be true to yourself. Those 4 small words, that short sentence, had transformed her life. It had given her the push to take a long, hard look at her life and the path her future was taking. Yes, it had been difficult admitting to her parents and to herself that she wasn't happy. That she wasn't happy being on the career path she was, living in the city, everything. Next to her, Puddle's ears shot up, the fur on his neck bristling. She turned to look, and sure enough, a couple had stepped onto the beach, walking their West Highland. Sally looked down at Puddles and wrapped his